Welcome to our second HMEI Faculty Seminar for the 2022 year. Today we have Professor Blair Schoene from the Department of Geosciences. Blair is a It's a little weird.
He's muting, not checking what I am.
Yeah, no, I'm not ready for Hollywood yet to hear my own voice as I speak. Anyway, Blair is a geologist who uses a range of experimental and laboratory techniques to understand the Earth's history. In particular, one of the areas that he is going to talk to us about is finding the sort of the timing of the creation of the Deccan traps to allow us to better place them in context to the mass extinction 66 million years ago, plus or minus 2 weeks. That's right. And so Blair, many of you know him, you see him around, is a wonderful colleague. He got his PhD from MIT in 2006, was it? Mm-hmm. Yes, and he is a professor here in geosciences. And two little pieces of information that you want to have about him is that he received the F.W. Clark Award from the Geochemical Society, which is sort of the highest award that an early career investigator will receive. And the other piece of information is that Blair has not updated his CV on his website since 2015. Hopefully we will learn a little bit more updated information on the dinosaurs and maybe on Blair. Thank you.
Thanks. I always say you can find out when people got tenure based on when they stopped updating their CV on their website. So that was 2015. Well, in any case, thanks for the invitation, Gabe, to give this talk, and thanks to everyone for coming. I've been to a number of these HMEI faculty seminars, and I know and hope that there's a fairly broad audience out there. So I've tried to strike a balance here such that I keep non-geoscientists and non-scientists, in fact, interested in what I'm going to say and have it be instructional, but then also have enough of the meat of the science to keep other folks who know something about what I do fairly engaged. And so as Gabe said, I consider myself a geologist and also a geochronologist. And for those not in geo, you may be wondering what a geochronologist is. And put simply, it's the study of trying to measure time. And in particular, measure geologic time as precisely and accurately as possible. And so to demonstrate sort of why that's important and convince those of you who don't know what it is that it's actually something worth doing, we will start with this. I know from other people, they press the button and then press it again and it starts shooting forward. So. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'll start with a rather cartoony example of the geologic timescale. What the geologic timescale is basically the way geologists demarcate time through Earth history. It's kind of like the weeks and months of geologic time. And this is broken down in a way such that we put the oldest time periods down here at the bottom, and then we work our way up towards the youngest at the top where we are in the present. And the reason we arrange the geologic timescale like that is because it is a depiction of how sedimentary rocks are deposited on the Earth's surface. And sedimentary rocks are the ones that record everything we know about the ocean atmosphere and biological evolution through Earth history. So sedimentary rocks are deposited one after another, so they get younger as you go upwards in time. And so on the left side of this diagram here are little cartoony depictions of what you might find that characterizes the time periods that they're next to. So there's a few words on here you may recognize if you've never looked at geologic timescale before. One is Jurassic, one is Cretaceous. Maybe you've heard of the Cambrian before. And what you see on the right-hand side of the diagram are these little numbers here. And these are ages in millions of years ago. Okay, and so obviously to come up with absolute ages for this timescale, you need something like geochronology so we can measure the ages of rocks. But it's not just the numbers that are actually important, it's what we can do with those numbers to tell something about geologic time. Without numbers on this geologic timescale, you can't say anything about the rates of geologic processes. And really, when you start looking in detail, you need numbers to tell you something about cause and consequences of events that we see recorded in these rocks. So to further illustrate that point, I'll use an analogy which I think was first made famous by Charles Darwin, who said, the geologic record is like a book with the pages torn out. And that actually turns out to be pretty accurate in that the geologic record, despite having knowledge that things young as you go upwards, so you know the relative age of events, there could be big chunks of time missing. And in fact, there often are big chunks of time missing. And really, rocks are awful at recording events at the Earth's surface, but they're all we have to try and understand what happened in Earth history. And so if you have a big chunk of pages missing from your book, if you want to know, in the absence of page numbers, if you want to know how many pages are missing, you need geochronology to actually tell you how much time has passed in those rocks. And furthermore, oftentimes the events we're trying to compare in the geologic record are not actually stacked like this at all. They may actually look something like this. And the job of the geologist and Earth historians is to take these pages and try and place them back in order and decipher what they're trying to tell us about Earth history. So, with that context, part of the reason I put the stratigraphic column here, young and upwards, is because I'm going to show a lot of figures that sort of assume your knowledge that when I show them, things are getting younger upwards. So one of the best examples of needing to understand cause and consequence in the geologic record has to do with mass extinction events in Earth history. And it turns out, by accident or not, that a lot of the boundaries between these different time periods are marked by extinction events, because it was basically built by looking at the biology recorded in them. And so the big 5 mass extinction events, as people like to call it, happened at the end of the Ordovician, the end of the Devonian, the biggest in Earth history, the end of the Permian, another one 50 million years later at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, and then of course one at the end of the Cretaceous. And so I'm going to focus on, for the most of this talk, on the end of the Cretaceous, because that's something my group has devoted a lot of time to in the last 8 years, and also because for a broad audience it's actually one that is fun to talk about, in part because you've all heard of it before. Come on, advance. It's going to advance in a second. So one of the reasons you've all heard about it before is because it's when the dinosaurs went extinct. And so if you've spent any time reading, yeah, I did that. If you spend any time reading children's books, for example, either when you were growing up or because you have kids, I'm going to become impatient with this. Okay, then you may have seen books like this, and so what we all know is that the dinosaurs existed, and about 66 million years ago, they all went extinct. And the other thing we know about this extinction event, or think we do, is that it was solely caused by a meteorite impact that hit the Earth and caused everything to die. What is less well advertised is that there's actually a number of different competing hypotheses for what killed the dinosaurs and other animals at that time. And whereas the asteroid impact is extremely compelling, there's also reason to think that wide-scale volcanism on the planet may have played a role in this extinction event. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going through the arguments for these two things, and then focus in on the volcanism aspect, because that's what we've been focusing on in our lab for the last number of years. I'll also point out another reason for liking to talk about these types of things is because I get to show sort of pop art images like this, where animals are about to meet their demise, especially like the one on the right, where it's not exactly clear what's going on, but there's a dinosaur choking on its own vomit or something like that as a result of volcanism. So the evidence for the asteroid impact as a cause for extinction dates back about 40 years. It was well known before that the dinosaurs had gone extinct. They'd been studied for many decades before that. But if you grew up in the 70s like I did, your children's books didn't mention a meteorite at all. It mentioned a bunch of different questions that were being asked about why they went extinct. But really it was in around 1980 where there was a discovery in rocks in Italy, where, again, this is a picture here, a stratigraphic column where things get younger as you go upwards, and this boundary here marks the extinction event. And what was discovered at that boundary is an enrichment in an element called iridium, which you probably don't think about every day, but the bottom line is it's very rare on Earth and very abundant in meteorites. And so when this was found, it was hypothesized that a meteorite struck the Earth and was obliterated, and all the iridium in that meteorite was deposited around the Earth. And so you see this spike in abundance right at the boundary. And so that gave birth to the impact hypothesis for the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so over the next decade or so, people went around the planet looking for evidence, similar evidence, in other rocks that record this event around the world. And this is a summary from 2010 that shows a bunch of the sites where you find evidence for an impact right around the end-Cretaceous mass extinction. And so by 1990, this hypothesis had become very popular, but they still hadn't found the smoking gun. There was no crater to actually show that this actually happened at the right time. And so in 1990, there was this paper published here that used actually geophysical data to image an impactor site, which is shown here in this circular structure down here on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And so this is gravity data. So if you walk around here, you don't know that you're in a crater, but it can be imaged geophysically. And so this, at the time, was considered the smoking gun. This was the proof that the impact hypothesis was correct, that there was an impact at that time. And so you might ask, given this abundant evidence, why do we keep thinking about volcanoes as a possible cause for the extinction event? And the reason is because in 1990, a figure like this did not exist. And what this is showing is that on the x-axis here are the ages of large, what do we call large igneous provinces, huge volcanic events. And then on the y-axis are the ages of crises in Earth history, be it mass extinctions or environmental events such as hyperthermal events, big warmings. And what you can see is that these things fall almost on a one-to-one line. And so when you start piecing this together, it becomes very compelling that in fact a lot of the crises we see in Earth history and mass extinction events could in fact be driven by these volcanic events. And that includes the end-Cretaceous mass extinction here, which lines up with one of these events in addition to the meteorite impact. So if nothing else, there is precedent in the geologic record to suggest that these types of events can cause mass extinction events. And so that one occurred right around the end-Cretaceous mass extinction seems like evidence enough. We should look at it and try and figure out whether it contributed to the mass extinction event or not. So what types of volcanoes are we talking about? What is a large igneous province? Well, basically they're caused by mantle plumes intersecting the lithosphere in the upper part of the Earth and causing sort of effusive eruptions, not unlike this. And we know now they occur in usually less than 1 million years, but the volumes of magma or basalt that comes out of here are huge. They're really huge. And so here's some of the pink, where you find them on Earth. The pink blobs here are large igneous provinces that date back as old as, say, 400 million years or so. And so the one that erupted at the end of the Cretaceous is right here. So to put these things into context, I'll show some other types of volcanic eruptions that you may be more familiar with. These are a bunch of circles that the area of the circle correlates with the volume of a volcanic eruption. Ones you may have heard of are, say, Mount St. Helens that erupted in 1980. A bunch of you were alive then. I was 2 years old living in Seattle, so I think I saw the plume of ash coming out of Mount St. Helens, but don't remember it. What I do remember is this one, 1991, Pinatubo, which is the second largest of this style of eruption in the 20th century. And interestingly, this eruption is known in part because sulfur dioxide released from this eruption caused global cooling of about 0.5 degrees Celsius for several years. This is a relatively small eruption. Ones that are called super eruptions are these orange things here. These are the ones maybe you've heard about in the news or watched movies like Super Volcano that are made for TV movies, mostly that focus on Yellowstone, because beneath Yellowstone there's a volcano that may or may not have magma present that could erupt, but what it does have is a history of these types of eruptions occurring over the last several millions of years. And these would be truly devastating if they actually occurred. We've never seen one as humans, but if they were to happen, it would have consequences for everybody on the planet. Now, what's not on here are large igneous provinces, the types that cause mass extinction events. Here they are. So this is the little diagram I had on the last page. This is the volume of these things. So they're 1,000 times larger than these things we call super eruptions. Now, to be fair, these occur over hundreds of thousands of years. Super eruptions happen over weeks. So there's a timescale difference, but there's also a huge volume difference. And so some of the potential side effects we'll talk about that these may cause have to do with the gases released from these volcanoes, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, et cetera. Okay, so as I pointed out on the other picture, the large igneous province that erupted around the end of the Cretaceous are called the Deccan Traps in western India. And actually the hypothesis existed before the impact hypothesis that these were responsible for the mass extinction event. And this was really championed by a guy named Dewey McLean, who was working through the 70s. What he was actually originally focused on was the long-term climate change over the Cretaceous and the observed cooling that happened over many millions of years. And hypothesized that that was what led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And then he got interested in what the effect of these volcanic events may have been to actually contribute to the extinction. And in a rather prescient article, started thinking about a greenhouse world in which carbon dioxide released from these volcanoes could have led to significant disruptions in ecosystems in a mass extinction event. So this was happening around the time the impact hypothesis was developed. And there's good reason to think that these volcanoes did actually impact climate towards the end of the Cretaceous. Here's two data sets. You don't need to understand much about what's going on these figures, except that on the y-axis here on both of them is time, younging upwards, and the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, so the main part of the extinction events, are shown here and here. And using a couple different types of data sets, these papers argue that in the late Cretaceous, you see warming within hundreds of thousands of years of the mass extinction event and then subsequent cooling. And so we're talking about warming and cooling of, say, 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, something like that. These ones here are derived from paleotemperature from fossil leaves, and these are derived from oxygen isotopes within foraminifera and deep sea sediments. And so people feel happy attributing this warming and cooling event to the Deccan Traps having started erupting before the mass extinction event. And then when it gets contentious is discussion about whether these actually contributed to the extinction or not. Okay, so here's a complicated diagram that many people like to show to try to explain how volcanic events can lead to mass extinctions. All you need to take away from this diagram, this was actually made for the Siberian traps, which I'll come back to later, but it's equally applicable to any of these large igneous province events. All you need to see here is that in black here is an eruption. In green here are things that come out of the volcano, and then cascading downwards are the types of effects this may have on the planet before you get to red, mass extinction event. And so this is just a schematic diagram. Each one of these arrows between these boxes is a whole field of study. And there's actually very few of these arrows where we can actually point to and quantify what these arrows actually mean. And how do we look for these in the rock record, and how do we actually determine if any of these things were actually important? One of the things that I'll argue, and what we're trying to focus on, is if we want to know whether, say, carbon dioxide emissions were important in the mass extinction event versus, say, sulfur dioxide emissions, we need to look at the rates at which they're erupted from the volcano. And so this brings us back to geochronology. So to think about those rates, this is a diagram that may be helpful. One way to think about it is if we want to understand if carbon dioxide was important, and we need to look at the rock record to understand that, we need to resolve events within the rock record with timescales that are applicable to those particular volatile elements. So what's shown on the x-axis here are the timescales that any particular volatile element is effective in the atmosphere. You can think of it as the residence time, perhaps, of that species in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is, as many people probably know, we need to worry about that on timescales of, say, thousands to tens of thousands of years. Compared to sulfur dioxide, the one that caused cooling from Pinatubo, operates on the timescale of years, something like that. So if we want to know something about carbon dioxide, we need to be able to date rocks, basically, to determine the eruption ages and timescales of the Deccan traps with uncertainties of, say, thousands, tens of thousands of years. So just to say what the state of the field was, say, 10 years ago or so, this is yet another diagram where rocks are younging upwards. These are formations I'll come back to later within the Deccan trap. So these are names for various units that are stacked up on top of each other within the volcano that is the Deccan traps. And over here is time on the x-axis and then a bunch of dates. So these are dates for the corresponding heights of rocks with uncertainties associated with those. And as of 10 years ago, the uncertainties on these dates are plus or minus millions of years. So if we want to talk about rates of eruption, and we can't even tell the difference between the bottom and the top of the volcanic pile in terms of the geochronology, we're kind of stuck. So what we're trying to do then is come up with a way to date these rocks more precisely so that we can say more about the eruption rates of these things. To do that, we've used the technique that we specialize in my lab. It's called uranium-lead geochronology and capitalizes on the decay of 2 isotopes of uranium to 2 isotopes of lead with known half-lives. And so for each of these decays, you can write in a relatively simple equation where you measure the ratio of, say, lead-206 to uranium-238, and you can calculate time knowing this constant here. And you can do that for the other decay system as well. And so that's what we do up in our lab, is measure these ratios and date rocks. This diagram here is just a simple depiction of how we look at these types of data. Ideally, if you date a rock or mineral using this system, the dates you get from both of these equations end up being the same. And so this is simply a check of that, such that rocks that give the same age should plot on this line. If they don't, you know to question your data or to question the age you get from that. We're going to be focused down in this time range down here. One of the primo minerals that we use for this technique is called zircon. Which is zirconium silicate. It's ideal for uranium-lead geochronology because when it crystallizes, it has a bunch of uranium in it and it has no lead. And so it's like a little time capsule. After it crystallizes, the uranium starts decaying to lead, and then it just sits there doing that until you go pick it up. And then you can measure the ratio of lead to uranium and use the equations on the previous slide to calculate dates. One of the good things about zircon, or additional good things, is that it's also resistant to weathering. It doesn't break down in nature, so we can use that to our advantage to date very old things. So here's just sort of one slide introduction to what we do in our lab. We take our zircon crystals. I'll show you later a little bit about how we actually get them. These are very small, right? So we need to separate them from the rocks that we're actually working on. We then dissolve them in acid, and then we in a clean lab up on the second floor, we separate uranium and lead from everything else in the zircon, and then we put it into a mass spectrometer. And we basically take our sample, put it on a little filament here, and put that filament inside this machine here, and hit go. And then we start measuring ratios over and over and over and over again. And we end up with dates that are very precise because of the time we spend measuring them. So that's your introduction to geochronology. Basically, the bottom line here is that using this technique, we can expect uncertainties on our dates of about 30 to 60,000 years, something like that, which, if you recall, is around the time frame we want to be able to date things to ask questions about volcanic emissions and carbon dioxide. We're not going to be able to say much about sulfur dioxide, which has timescales of years in the atmosphere. So we would love to be able to do that, but we can't. So one issue with applying this method, though, to dating flood basalts is that flood basalts very seldom have this mineral zircon that I just told you why it's so great. And if the rocks we're trying to date don't have this mineral, we obviously can't do that. However, there are some basalts that have been found associated with mass extinction events, such as this one, the North Mountain basalt that erupted 201 million years ago during the end-Triassic mass extinction event, which do have zircon in them. And so I won't go into detail why or why they don't have much zircon in them, but the bottom line is that we felt enthusiastic about trying to search in the Deccan Traps for rocks similar to this, to try and find material that we could date with very high precision. So back in 2013, got together with a team from the department here and collaborators in India and went out to look at the Deccan Traps. Here's some, but not all the people that have been involved in this work. Some of the most important people are Syed Kadri from the University of Amravati, who is one of our collaborators in India. He was one of the folks throughout the 80s and 90s with his boots on the ground, characterizing these rocks, making maps, and measuring these rocks in detail. And that framework really is the reason we can do this work now. And so his involvement, both from his previous work and his collaboration in the field, has been super important. And here you may recognize Gerda Keller, who I'll point out, who has been a huge proponent for keeping the volcanic hypothesis alive in relation to mass extinction events over decades. And this whole work really began because of conversations she and I were having and arguing about whether geochronology could actually help contribute to this problem or not. And so we took up the challenge and went to India. And various students, PhD students, postdocs, undergrads have assisted in this work since. So in 2013, we headed off to India. I'm going to give you a little background about the geology of the Deccan Traps so you have a vision for what this volcano actually looks like. As I said before, it's located in western India. All the red rocks here are part of the Deccan Traps. It's basically a single volcano. It's about the size of Texas, or 25 times the size of New Jersey, if that's more helpful. What you can see is that this is a sort of topographic map. It's a shaded relief map where the yellow colors are high elevation and the green elevations are low, or green colors are low elevation. And so along this escarpment here, it's basically been eroding into these rocks for 60 million years. And what it means is that when you go up and down these hills here, you get fantastic exposures of these rocks. So here's just a few photos. This one you may recognize from the advertisement for the talk. If you've seen any pictures of the Deccan Traps, it's probably that one, because it's a famous overlook by the side of the road where you can go and look at these things. These horizontal black lines here are all lava flows, and this goes for kilometers down. It's huge. It's a huge, thick pile of basalts, and it's all over here. So actually covering this ground requires knowing how these rocks all fit together. So here's just one view. Here's another view from up near the city of Pune, where we're on top of a hill here, looking off into the valley. So again, you can see these exposures of these rocks over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And finally, here's just one more view of what these rocks look like. It's a really fantastic countryside to spend time in, filled with fantastic, wonderful people who are always super helpful in everything we do and interested in what we're working on as well. So it's a really wonderful place to work. Now, how is the geology actually figured out? Now, again, this is a big area. It requires a lot of walking and a lot of driving to cover it. And as I said, luckily, people through over decades before us going there spent a lot of time on the ground mapping out these rocks. And so what you see here is basically a cross-section. If you were to walk up a hill like this one here, where you see these different basalt flows. So this is a depiction of the types of rocks you see as you walk up here. And people did this over many, many different hills through Western India and correlated the same types of rocks, both using their physical appearance and crystals within them, and also the geochemistry of those rocks to come up with correlations and track out different units to build a stratigraphy of the volcano. And so here's just one example of doing that over tens of kilometers, where one hillside shows exposures of these units here that can then be tracked across hillsides as you go this direction. What you can see is they're dipping, meaning they're not flat, they're sort of tilted down to the southeast. And the only way you can figure this out is by making maps like this, because you can't see the rocks are tilting when you're standing on them. They're dipping about, say, 0.1 degrees or 0.2 degrees. So they basically look flat when you're standing on them. So you really have to do the geology in detail to determine this. Okay, so when you do that across the Western Ghats here, as it's called, you end up with a sort of cartoon depiction like this, where these things are dipping off to the south, and so it basically makes this layer cake of basaltic rocks. The colors are to depict different formations as are defined by the chemistry of the rocks. And so to cover this, so you can put those together and end up with, again, another stratigraphic section like this, where things are younging as you go upwards. And so I'll show most of our data in relation to this. You don't need to worry about the names of the formations here. You can focus on the colors, or just know that as you go upwards, they're getting younger. Okay, so when we headed off to India, remember we were in search of these coarse-grained rocks that we thought might contain the mineral zircon that we could actually date. And one of the good things about doing work here is both, as I mentioned, the topography, so you can actually see large sections of these rocks, but also there's roads all over the place. And so you can cover a lot of ground looking at a lot of rocks. And what we noticed in a few days doing this, walking up and down roads like this, is the types of rocks we were looking for, these basalts that might have zircon. You can tell by the grain size of the basalts whether they're likely to contain zircon or not. We didn't find any of them. And so within a couple of days, we were kind of depressed that this was a big waste of time and we were going to fail. And then we came across this thing here. And what you're seeing here is a basalt flow here, and then a basalt flow here. And in between that basalt flow is sort of this cruddy, muddy material with a greenish color. And we got really excited when we saw that, because a greenish color to a geochronologist means that it might be an ash bed that contains zircon. So something sourced from another volcano that is deposited along this horizon before this basalt flow was deposited on top of that. So a cartoon to show that in a little more detail. You have a basalt flow here, so a lava flow that then sits there for a while. You have deposition of an ash bed that comes from a totally separate volcano, and then more basalt laid on top of that. And from the look of the ash, we were suspicious that these may actually have these little zircon crystals that we can date. And so we started focusing on these layers between different basalts. Often they, instead of green, they look reddish because they're weathered horizons at the top of flows. If you've ever been to Hawaii or something like that, you'll notice the rock that's exposed at the surface turns red very soon after it erupts. And it's because the iron oxidizes and turns red. And so you know when you see that at the top of a lava flow that it was exposed to the surface for some period of time before the next lava flow was deposited on top of that. So we started looking for these, of which many people had noticed them before and actually recorded where they were found. And we started sampling those, looking for ash beds that might contain zircon in them. And sure enough, a bunch of them did. And so here's just a couple examples of what one of those layers looks like. And then when you look up close, some of them actually look like ash beds that you would expect to find out in the field and other places. And when you crush these rocks up here in Geo Hall and separate minerals, you sometimes find this mineral zircon. And this is what they look like in the microscope. This is about 200 microns here. And so we found a bunch of samples that had these little zircons in them that look very volcanic from our experience looking at a whole lot of zircons. And you can tell because of these sort of sharp, pointy sides here that are indicative they haven't been transported along the earth and formed into little sand grain balls. So over the next 3 or 4 years, we went back to India and collected more and more and more of these things. And we covered a lot of ground from north to south. What you see here is a cross-section, like you're cutting through a layer cake from north to south here, that's depicting these basalt flows, the formations that are, again, dipping off to the south. So every gray dot on here is where we sampled one of these red horizons that we call red bowls. And then every colored dot is where we actually found one that contained zircon, so contained material that we could actually date. And we package them up in boxes. We collect large samples. This is about 2 days, 3 days worth of work. Fill boxes, go to the post office, send them back, and do it again 3 days later. So we end up with a massive amount of material in the basement of GeoHall that then I pay people to process over years, and they look for zircon. So of the 140 or so of these samples we collected, 24 had zircons that we could actually date. And this is hundreds of hours of processing these things to actually find these 24 samples. And then we date those and spend many more thousands of hours on the mass spectrometer dating them. But what you end up with is something like this, where now again I'm showing this volcanic stack on the y-axis here, and each one of these data points and uncertainties is our estimate for the timing of the deposition of that horizon, determined from anywhere between 5 and 25 zircon analyses. So what you can see is things get younger as you go upwards. This x-axis here has time increasing to the right, so towards the present to the left. So what you want to see is that things go towards the left as you go upwards, which they do, which is a good sign. And so what you can then do is plot all these things together, and when you do that, you end up with something like this. So now each of the gray bars is an estimate for the timing of deposition of a particular basalt or bed between the basalts. And then the sort of brown sausage-looking thing is a model. It's a Bayesian statistical model that takes into account the uncertainties of all these different ash beds to come up with what we call an age model. So it's our best estimate for how time changes as you go upwards. And so on the y-axis here, I'm now not quite plotting height in the basalt pile. What I'm plotting is volume. And so it's estimates for how much volume was erupted as you go upwards. And the reason to do that is because if you then look at the steepness of this, the slope of this curve, what you're looking at is volume over time. And so it's an eruption rate of a basalt over time through the entirety of the volcanic package. And then plotted here, in these gray bars here, is our estimated age for the Chicxulub impact, so the meteorite impact and the end of the Cretaceous. And so you can plot these data in a slightly different way. Instead of plotting volume versus time, you can plot eruption rate versus time. So you're basically plotting the derivative of this thing. And what you get is something like this, where we're now looking at eruption rate, and what you can see is that these basalts erupted in pulses like this that are separated by relative lulls in eruption. So in the previous figure, if it was steep, that means it's erupting fast. If it's not steep, it's erupting slow. And so that ends up forming something like this. And there's a bunch of interesting things you can see on this plot. One is that one of these pulses has the ability to, say, quadruple or quintuple the total volcanic productivity on Earth today. So this one volcano is quadrupling the amount of volcanic eruptions that on the Earth, if eruptions at the time were similar to what they are now. The other thing you see is that this very big pulse here happened right before the meteorite impact and the mass extinction event. And so it sort of furthers the question, if this is a big outpouring of basalt and volatiles associated with that, could this have been important in sort of deteriorating ecosystems before the meteorite impact? And this is essentially overlapping with the date of the impact. And just for a little context, using sort of back of the envelope calculations, this volcanic pulse here has about enough CO2 that's about 2 times the modern atmospheric content of carbon dioxide. In terms of sulfur, this is equivalent to basically erupting 1 Mount Pinatubo a year for 50,000 years. And so it's a lot of stuff coming out of the volcano. So you can then start to ask the question of, could this have contributed quantitatively to climate change that we see in the rock record, or maybe we don't see it, and ask questions of why we don't see it. Okay, so the next obvious thing to do is then compare this eruption record of these basalts, now that we have the geochronology to start looking at eruption rates, compare that to climate records, similar to the ones I showed you earlier. you can ignore this bottom diagram here. This one here is the same thing I showed you earlier. So this is estimated temperature change determined by looking at oxygen isotopes in critters living in the ocean. And what you see is this warming event and then cooling event that I pointed to before. And so with these data, we sort of confirm that, in fact, this warming event begins about the same time as the Deccan traps. What you don't see here is a one-to-one correspondence with, say, warming and volcanic eruptions, and anything that's happening as a result of the volcanic eruptions after the extinction event is relatively subdued. And so you can take these types of data and put them into carbon cycle models, which people have done and published. And here's one example of that. This is an example from Pincelli-Hull's work up at Yale, where they took here's the brown curve here, which is again the temperature record. This is now younging going upwards. I showed that same record tilted on its side. And then run simulations for basically spitting CO2 into the atmosphere and see what you get in terms of temperature change. And so these are various scenarios for rates of CO2 emissions to see if you match the curve. This one here is meant to represent our eruption rates. And what you can see is there's not a great match, basically because you don't see a great increase in carbon dioxide from some of these pulses here. And so their preferred record was that in fact most of the carbon dioxide came out before the mass extinction event and before this pulse that was immediately before the mass extinction event. So you can ask the question of, why is there not a more obvious correspondence between the climate records and the volcanic records? So using these models, and there's a bunch of different possibilities. Two I won't talk about much is one, that the data are not telling us what we think they are, so the data about climate change. Two is that the carbon cycle models are not representing carbon cycle on Earth as well as we would like them to. The next couple options have to do with the Deccan traps themselves, and I'll talk in a little bit of detail about those. So one option is that our work is based on exposures of basalts on land, estimates for what this volcano looked like before erosion and before further rifting of India from Madagascar, is basically that the volcano probably looked like this circle here, which means that about a third of it is now underwater. And we have no idea what's there, basically. So our record is biased towards what we can actually go see on land. So you could make arguments that our eruption rates are biased by things that we can't see here. It's hard to argue with that. You could also go into more details about sorting out the actual geologic records themselves, which certainly needs to be done. Some of the other biggest uncertainties in what we've done so far is sort of the assumption, or at least test, of whether the volatiles emitted from a volcano correspond with the eruption rates of that volcano. There's good reason to believe that's not the case. One of those reasons comes from this figure here. You don't need to understand the details too much, but basically this is estimates of sulfur in an erupted lava. I don't need to tell you too much about how these estimates are made, but the bottom line is if you look at single basalt flows and try and measure the amount of sulfur in them, you get wildly different numbers. And so that either means that either the sulfur is not contained in those flows, our ability to measure it is bad, or that it's super variable. And so basically then, just assuming that the amount of sulfur you get does not correspond one-to-one with the amount of basalt you get erupted from the volcano. Finally, there's a hypothesis that the volatiles coming out of the magma itself are actually less important than volatiles coming out of the crust. And what I mean by that is I can show you sort of a cartoonish model for what is envisioned for the Siberian traps. So this is the large igneous province that erupted at the end Permian mass extinction event. And what's been argued there is that the basalts themselves erupted through sedimentary rocks that contained a lot of, say, carbon. Basically, you can think of it as coal if you want. And the magma coming up through the crust would basically interact with this coal and then burn it. And we all know what happens when you burn coal. You get a bunch of carbon dioxide and it goes into the atmosphere. And so this potential source of carbon into the system is very difficult to quantify, but has been argued to be very important in this mass extinction event. Some evidence for that comes from these records here. So now that we're jumping back to the Permian period, 250 million years ago, where what you see here is time going younging in this direction. This pink zone here is estimated to be the interval of the mass extinction. Remember, this is the largest mass extinction in Earth history, where over 90% of species went extinct. Down here in purple are estimates determined by Geochronology, by these folks here, for the eruption or intrusion of these types of basalts through the Siberian traps. And what they argue is that you get eruptions up until the extinction event. And at that point, you have a transition towards magmas that are actually interacting with sediments in the crust and cooking them and releasing massive amounts of volatiles that way. And so you get this transition in the style of magmatism at that time, which resulted in the mass extinction event. So interestingly, and I'll point this out again in 1 second, the actual volcanoes began 300,000 years before the extinction event, which happened very quickly, which is similar to what we see in the end-Cretaceous, where the Deccan traps began hundreds of thousands of years before you have a sudden extinction event, except in that case we also have a meteorite impact to help us. So could this process of cooking sediments also be important in the Deccan traps? Well, we've done a little bit of work. I won't show you all the data, but basically just summarize that the next step of our work, which is now published, was up in this area here. Most of our work before was down here. And if you look up in this area up here, the volcanic material erupted through a big pile of sediments. These are now more cross sections going across, I should say, this area here, where in green are basically organic rich sediments and a ton of coal. So India gets most of its coal from these sedimentary layers here. And what we show in this study is that this part of the volcanic province here was some of the earliest eruptions, and that it erupted through this basin. So you can start asking questions about whether this process was important in the Deccan traps and then Cretaceous as well. And finally, just to sort of take that parallel home, we see this pattern in many mass extinction events where we have these large igneous provinces erupting, and yet the extinction event occurs long after they started, but itself is still very fast. So you can start to ask questions about whether this is sort of a threshold process where the ecosystems hung on during these eruptions until some point they just collapsed. So sort of the last straw to break the camel's back type of analogy, or were there specific events within the eruptions of these volcanoes that were more catastrophic than previous events, such that you suddenly cause an extinction event? And I don't think we really know the answer to that. But as I say here, there's a ton more work to be done, and that's sort of a direction of where the questions we're asking are headed. So I'll just stop there, how about, and we'll take questions.
All right, I'm happy to be the MC and take any questions that people have here in person, and I've also got to look at questions that might be online.
So Blair, you
Yep.
said it's one Pinatubo a year for 50,000 years. Is it one Pinatubo a year for 50,000 years, or is it a 50,000 Pinatubo once in 50,000 years?
Probably somewhere in between. Yeah, so on average, one Pinatubo per year. People have focused on the actual, so I've been focusing on durations of many eruption events, because that's what our geochronology can resolve. If you look at single flows, estimates for single flows, which may contain 1,000 cubic kilometers of magma, or a super eruption sized amount of magma. These are estimated to occur over decades to hundreds of years. And so those can be continual, but then if you sort of average that out, you're going to have a period.
Alan is asking about, essentially, I guess, how to count lava flows with the idea of how it relates to Gabe's question about SO2 emissions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can count them. You can basically, walking up the stratigraphy, count the number of flows. And what you'd find, they're anywhere between tens and hundreds in a 50,000 year period. Probably closer to tens over that time scale.
So you could have a lot more CO2 in a short.
Yeah, so within those pulses, like the accumulated effect of CO2 will be more than the accumulated effect of sulfur dioxide because the residence time is longer.
Yeah, I meant SO2. I mean, you can get a lot of SO2 in a short.
You could, yeah. But again, it has to do with the repose time between these eruptions, which again, you can average that out over the flows, but we can't really determine the duration of the hiatuses between them yet.
So we have a question from online as to where might the next massive volcano, I presume flood basalt, be forming?
I don't know. I would ask the geophysicists, because these volcanoes tend to form at the tops of mantle plumes, and those potentially can be imaged with seismic tomography. So if there are impending plumes that are about to impinge on the surface of the Earth, that's where I'd worry. I don't actually know. I'm looking at Jeroen up there. And it's we'll come back to you later.
You still have a question, Jeroen?
But I have a question, yeah. Where are the volcanoes that are responsible for the ash layers that you're dating?
So
Jeroen's question is, where are the volcanoes that are responsible for the ash layers that you're dating?
okay, so there's two options, and we've started to test this. One is this very northern part of the province. There are magmatic centers that are the right composition to have erupted these ash beds that we then find. What we've done to see if we can fingerprint those is look at the geochemistry of the zircons that we're measuring in our beds and compare those to those coming from the magmatic centers. And we've only looked at a few, say 5 or 6 of these magmatic centers, and they don't match, either in time or chemistry. The timing is roughly correct, but when you really look at it, they don't match. And there are some that are just completely bonkers in terms of their isotopic composition. We have no idea where they're coming from. And so I could speculate, but we really don't have an idea of where those are coming from. Some of them are thick. So the green one I showed you, that's a meter thick or so. So you can play games with, say look at ash beds that we know the sources and ask how far away it could be. And it's got to be within tens, hundreds of kilometers. And thus far, we haven't found anything that matches that well. It could be they're off in the ocean and we don't see them. So, but we'll keep looking.
So I've got a question, Blair. Well, somebody else gets one. You showed some of the historical eruptions, and one of the eruptions of Yellowstone was like within the Pleistocene, right? Within the last 800,000 years. I mean, do you see that in ice core records or anywhere else? Do we, is it just too short? Is there any evidence from any of these more recent big eruptions for climate effects?
So as far as I know, we don't see, say, ash beds in the ice core records, nor are there significant events that are recorded in, say, temperature estimates or something like that within ice cores that correspond to those exactly. There's been, so one of the largest, most recent eruptions is Toba, which is on Sumatra, and there's a lot of work that's been done on that eruption trying to correlate it because people were alive then, trying to correlate it with events that might be recorded in human history to some extent. And Elizabeth probably knows that work better than I do.
Laura.
I was wondering what are the evidences to explain the fact that the later eruptions have absolutely no signature in delta 18 in climate markers? Like, how is that possible that you have that like huge eruption and no signature?
Yeah, there's
Laura's asking about the mismatch between the eruptive history, the geochronology, and the temperature record.
Yeah, so there's a couple ideas that have asked that same question recently. One of the ways that people try and look at carbon dioxide that comes out of a particular eruption is by looking at what are called melt inclusions within minerals in that lava. And these are basically little bubbles of melt that are trapped within minerals. And if they trapped it at the right time, you can measure what's in the bubbles as an estimate of carbon dioxide that was in the liquid before it erupted. And this is very hard to do, both the measurements themselves, but also because a lot of the carbon dioxide has outgassed by the time these things crystallize, and so you lose a lot of it. So these are lower estimates. But nonetheless, this work has been done and maybe found that the amount of carbon dioxide in those lavas is less than those previously. And so you can start asking questions of whether that's a source feature, such that if you continually melt the same rocks, do you lose all the carbon dioxide early, such that as you continue to do that, that the amount of carbon dioxide lessens through time? Or is it a process in the crust based on where they're erupting through? So that's kind of the direction people are going with that. Travis?
Regarding like eruption volume and time, why is it pulsed and not just like a single waxing and waning period of a buildup of eruption and then a decline?
So the question is, why is the volcanism pulsed?
Easiest answer is we don't know. More complicated answer is that when you try and model how magma comes from the mantle, goes into the crust and builds up magma chambers, and then moves further upwards in the crust, and then builds up subsequent magma chambers, and then finally erupts, there's sort of an interaction between the rate at which you put basalt into the crust and then the volatile release from that, such that it can build up pressure over time in those magma chambers and then start migrating magma up from that. And some of these models show that you might expect hiatuses like this, that you'd expect pooling up of magma in the lower crust before it then moves upwards catastrophically every once in a while. So that's the best answer I can give. There's others who don't believe that the pulse model is actually correct and that you would expect more continual eruptions.
I was very excited to hear that you guys are finding places where you can look at the relationship between the intrusion of these basalts and sediments that could be emitting gases like the coal.
Mm-hmm.
Where else, or are there other places where you can find these contact relationships that you would need other than this one example, since the province is so large?
Yeah, great
So
question.
the question is where to...
Which will be repeated.
Yeah, I'm going to have a hard time even repeating this. Is it essentially where to look for the right sorts of deposits and contacts to find zircons to date volcanism?
Yeah. So where this has been observed, Elizabeth's like, that wasn't quite the question. I'll repeat the question. The question was, if you're interested in contacts between magma and sediments from which carbon dioxide can be derived, where do you go to look? And so I pointed towards the northern part of the province, where actually there are coal mines with dikes cross-cutting them. And my collaborators have been there. We want to go back there, but obviously haven't been able to because of COVID. But that's where we'll go to look. And those are spanned out along the Narmada River, over hundreds of kilometers. And one problem with doing that in the Deccan Traps is that they're young, right? And so they're not super well eroded. And so the intrusive relationships are not well exposed compared to other large igneous provinces like the Karoo basalts or something like that, which has been a place where people have really championed this idea that contact with sediments is a big source of carbon dioxide, just because you get that view deeper into the crust than you do in the Deccan.
Yes.
We connect the pattern of what actually has died and didn't die with these gas-driven hypotheses.
Yeah, so as people have tried to do this mostly from the oceanic record, asking questions about carbon dioxide release versus evidence for, say, ocean acidification and how that affects calcifying organisms. And as I showed you, there's not a great match between the temperature record and the eruption record. But if you take the temperature record and then calculate an amount of CO2, you can then look at deterioration of organisms that do form these calcite shells. And people have said there is a correspondence that you start to see degradation of these organisms that then does match well with the temperature records. And that's before the main extinction event. And sort of beyond that, right at the extinction horizon, it gets a bit more complicated, but yeah, that's sort of the best example where there is a one-to-one, potentially, correspondence. And for the land record, part of the difficulties there, I showed you estimates from leaves for this warming and cooling event that seem to match with what you see in the ocean. And then in terms of actual large charismatic organisms like dinosaurs, one of the issues with correlating those with anything is that they're so rare in the fossil record that you can't really build up the fossil database to say quantitative things about climate or anything like that. So that's more of a challenge. But when you get to sort of smaller vertebrates, people are starting to do that as databases build up. And start to ask questions about what's happening in various ecosystems through this transition as opposed to others.
They're running out of things to eat, is that?
It's a good question, yeah. I mean, that's part of it is if global warming is the trigger, then yes, you'd sort of have is it bottom up? Yeah, degradation of the ecosystems.
All right, well,
We
have one more question.
What are the hypotheses that connects the volcano eruption and the dinosaur extinction? Like the temperature change or like the density there, like sulfur dioxide?
So the question is, what is the kill mechanism between volcanism and the extinction?
People argue back and forth about this. On the one hand, as you point out, you have global warming from carbon dioxide. On the other hand, you have global cooling from sulfur dioxide. One of the challenging parts about answering that question is that evidence for short-term but catastrophic cooling is basically absent from the rock record. And so if you want to look at very short-term events, you're hard-pressed to find them within the rock record, whereas the evidence for warming is abundant. Now, just because the evidence for warming is abundant doesn't mean that was the kill mechanism. It means it probably happened. But if, in fact, short-term events superimposed on that trend are what actually did most of the damage is a possibility. And some people argue very strongly that it needs to be sulfur that's actually causing the damage rather than carbon dioxide, because it happens on short timescales and organisms have less opportunity to adapt.
All right, well, let's thank Blair again.
Okay, real quick, I want to thank John Higgins from Geosciences for being today's discussant. I forgot to introduce him. And be sure to keep your eye out on first week of March. Allison Carruth is going to be giving us our next HMEI Faculty Seminar on April. Sorry, March is today. April. Okay, thank you.